Hey everyone, Thyworm here. I recently released a video on why I think Wolcen is worth playing in 2023. Assuming you agree, you clicked on this video after all, it's very hard to find builds these days. They're all pretty old and outdated and no one seems to be making content for Wolcen anymore. So I thought since I leveled my Necromancer all the way to level 85 anyway, and doing the pinnacle and most difficult endgame content, I would share my build and explain it to anyone who is interested. And for more ARPG content, be sure to subscribe. This build is a classic, a summon build. Not much else to say about it, it is a summon build like any other. It is worth noticing, however, that some time ago Wolcen got a big summon update and we're taking advantage of many of the changes made, such as summons being automatically revived after they die. That means we simply focus on damage output and don't care much for summon life. Some pros and cons about this build, starting with the pros. It is a well-rounded character, it can take a few hits from regular enemies, it maps well, it does bosses well, it is balanced. Leveling is smooth as summons tend to scale well with levels. I like summons, I hope you like summons, and if you don't like summons, this is not your build. The build is controller viable, I played mostly with a controller. Sometimes your summons block the way to an interactive element like a portal or some loot, but for the most part it's completely fine. And finally, the playstyle allows you to loot chests and corpses, which have many rewards, while your summons take care of business. Then the cons. Your army is rather strong, but you not so much. Boss abilities can one-shot you, but with 3 attempts it's definitely manageable. I suppose figuring out how to skill summons is difficult, but this guide will help you out. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about scaling summon damage. There are a few things that I discovered and I think you need to know. First, let's talk about attributes, meaning ferocity, agility, wisdom, and toughness. For every attribute point spent, you gain attribute bonus damage, which is multiplicative. However, it doesn't matter in which attribute you put points. You may think that agility, for example, increases the attack speed of the summons, but it doesn't. In fact, no single attribute does anything for summon damage apart from the attribute points themselves, which is why I put all points in toughness, because that gives me the best chance of survival. It is worth noticing that attributes on gear do add to the multiplicative bonus damage, so don't skimp out on 30 agility on a chest, for example, as that can offer a significant DPS increase to summons. But do realize that the attributes just by itself don't do a thing, it's just the bonus attributes damage that you get from it. Second, let's talk about which modifiers actually affect summons, in my case Hunting Swarm and Livor Mortis. I have 3 of each. You can duplicate the skills at certain skill levels after you unlock duplication in the city building part of Wolcen. Obviously, summon modifiers affect summons. You can find a whole node in the Gate of Fates, which I'm taking. It does appear on some gear as well, although it is very rare. I am using Feast of Canker's Shoulders, providing around 30% summon damage increase, for example. Regular damage, just generic damage, it just says damage on your gear. That also applies to summons. Gear dropped from Expedition, where you do the blood trail content and hunt a prey, can roll generic damage, which works. Some can also be found on the passive tree in the Gate of Fates. For some reason, summons scale with spells and not with attacks, even though most of my summons are clearly attacking. Especially flat damage to spells is huge for their DPS, so try to get a weapon with as much flat damage to spells as possible. It doesn't matter which weapon. I have a gun, for example, that has 232 to 356 flat damage spread across physical, frost, shadow, and ether. Just remember that you do need a catalyst in the offhand or you can't use summons, otherwise you need to go with a staff. Which brings me to my next point. I'm fairly certain that all the flat spell damage on your gear is increased, multiplied, and then converted into physical summon damage. It is not true that frost damage on my gun translates to frost damage for summons. At the start of calculating summon DPS, it converts all of your damage to physical damage, and depending on the damage type of your summon, it converts it back to whatever you choose. This is important to understand, because it means that elemental or occult damage doesn't scale your summon damage, even if you have frost minions. Because summon DPS is calculated from the initial value of their flat physical damage. The only thing that scales summon damage, therefore, is material. So make sure you put a ton of material damage increase on your gear and passive tree because it matters a lot. Sticking with spells increases the spell damage, and also spell damage multipliers work as well. My amulet, Mark of the Blackstaff, has a 20% spell skill damage multiplier, which is a straight up 20% more damage for summons. And finally, one more thing you can skill is projectile damage. It is not noted anywhere, but it works. Increases to projectile damage matter quite a bit. Little side note, I also discovered that ailments modifiers work. I don't use them, but the nodes seem to apply, so that is a route you can take as well. So with all this knowledge, let's repeat the conversion one last time as I feel it is happening. First, all flat spell damage is added and taken, and then that is increased by all the percentage increases to damage and spell damage, and then it is multiplied by any damage multiplier you may have. So my amulet and catalyst, but also the attribute bonuses, which are multiplicative. Then this number is converted to physical summon damage. And then I feel the increases and multiplicative effects on summons take place. So percentage increased summon damage, projectile damage and generic damage, plus of course the material damage, which increases the physical damage of summons. And only once that is all done, it converts the damage depending on the summon damage type you choose. So, your frost summons. That is why it doesn't matter in terms of DPS if you make a hunt and swarm do frost damage or toxic damage. The DPS after switching remains exactly the same. You would think it would scale with toxic damage, but I don't think it does, because if it did, you would expect the DPS number to vary between damage type variations, and it doesn't. The DPS is the same for whatever variation you choose. Let's take a look at the Gate of Fates using this knowledge. Unfortunately, all online planners are outdated, so I suppose you have to make a screenshot of what I'm showing you here. I am first moving to the summons part of the wheel. Along the way, I'm taking a bit of projectile damage. Please note that attack damage or crit damage does nothing, unless specifically mentioned. Once we are at the summons part, we take everything that scales damage, so summon damage, summon attack and cast speed, the sacrifice of flash notable, plus the 3 minor nodes behind it to make our summons take way less damage. And for additional defenses, I went Toxic Emanations, which slows enemies around me. I didn't find Undertaker to be useful as I don't cast any spells myself and toxic scaling isn't really a thing. I think only using summons is the way to go anyway. After we take all the points, we move to the ranger part because there's a lot of projectile stuff going on there. I think safe from afar works, scaling projectile damage by 30% depending on their distance, because all projectile modifiers seem to work. Meditative focus works for sure. It is generic damage and it takes you as the benchmark. So if you don't stand too close to enemies, which you don't want to do anyway, your summons deal 25% increased damage. Archean's teachings work too, giving all summons an extra projectile, which is basically doubling their damage, because projectiles can shotgun enemies. Both arrows can hit the same enemy, especially for bosses this is super useful. You do take a 20% less modifier, but it's definitely worth it. From this point I do travel down to White Arrow to get the 3 nodes that give a total of 35% projectile damage. It reduces attack speed, but that has no impact on our summons, because they aren't affected by regular attack or cast speed. The third and final route of the wheel goes into Warmonger because of the material damage nodes you can find over there. You take Gods Among Men, which is a 10% more damage multiplier. It doesn't matter that you can't deal other types of damage, you don't deal damage anyway. And because summons only scale off of the conversion, this is a great node. I'm taking any high attribute stat I can find, plus more material damage nodes in this region, and then we move towards Exorcist, which is mainly a defensive layer for us. Branded Burst reduces damage taken, helping us survive. Blasted Silver is a 50% projectile damage increase, once again improving summons DPS. There are more projectile and material damage nodes you can take over here. And I'm rounding out the whole tree with any high value nodes in the area, like 5% spell damage and 10 wisdom. Those are great nodes and just take whatever you can get at this point. It's time to look at some gear. I played a lot, I am level 85 and my gear is pretty good, but now you understand how to scale summons, you know what kind of gear is good. Without going into every single piece, you can see I'm having attributes, material damage, generic damage, a ton of flat spell damage multipliers, summon damage, and of course a little bit of life and resistances. Hopefully the gear makes sense now. Looking at the skills themselves, I would say it is rather straightforward. My Hunting Swarm skill, of which I have 3, all have the same setup: damage with venomous poison, lethal effort and unfeeling exertion. Move speed for summons is big, so take mortality in waves. Oxidized Edges makes projectiles pierce, which is great for clear, and Forces of Ruination adds a summon, which is simply a more multiplier, another minion. Spellbound Briskness is attack speed, also quite significant. You can take on any damage types you want, it doesn't really matter what you pick. I then have 2 Rend Liver Mortises. These are purely for damage as well, so take all the damage nodes, the move speed and the attack speed nodes. And finally I have 1 golem with a lot of health, which taunts for me and keeps me safe. This setup is purely defensive with Glutton Undying for HP, Generational Grief to have me take 15% less damage, Sacrifice to increase threat, Hateful Words to cause frenzy, making enemies attack each other. It is surprisingly useful, not for the damage, but just to make sure enemies don't attack me, but each other. And then a bunch of health nodes. You keep the original Liver Mortage damage type, because otherwise you can't taunt. After all of this, my Hunting Swarm deals 75,000 DPS and my Rend Golems even 137,000 DPS. It's not bad, and this setup truly melts through the endgame. Here's the build in action. The playstyle is rather straightforward, as with any summoner. Keep your distance, direct your summons using their skills, taunt using, the Liver Mortis with a lot of health, and avoid boss abilities. That's basically it. And that's also it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed this little guide and hopefully I enlightened you on summon scaling. I spent a good chunk of time on these guys to write them all and all the things, so that's why I don't release too many of them. If you appreciate the effort, consider liking or subscribing. It really helps me out. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Love you all. Bye bye.